What is going on with ICP? Are we still in the bullish structure? Are we still going to reverse the upside? All your questions will be answered. We'll also be talking about where we think ICP will be heading in the near future and just in the future in general. Look, ladies and gentlemen, obviously we've had a big sell-off candle for this week, but we did talk about how the first few days of August could be manipulation, and they most likely will, just because also of Bitcoin's timing, right? We know Bitcoin had a nice gap. Well, not necessarily super nice because it doesn't really benefit us, but Bitcoin had a gap around 114,000. And we can see it got filled, right? It got filled. And we can see Bitcoin's currently at 113,500. So it went a little bit lower than a gap, but it is kind of expected, right? It's kind of expected. Overall, I expect Bitcoin to, in general, be reversing sooner than later because I do believe Bitcoin does have more life to it, which means something like ICP should be growing and coming back to life over the next couple of days. Look, ladies and gentlemen, right? When this video does get posted, we will have just a couple of hours before we know how this weekly candle does close. The most important thing is not to close below 4.84. Okay. Now, the reason why I say this is because the closings are very important. As of right now, we have a low over here, we have a higher low. And if let's just say we closed over here, we would have a higher low again. So it would be one of those things where, even though we dipped, the market makers are still putting enough pressure, they're still buying enough to the point where, you know, something like ICP doesn't go back to its previous levels and it doesn't close below certain levels, which means the floor is consistently rising, even if it is slowly, right? We also know that the roof did rise, right? Because we had a roof over here, we had a lower roof over here, we had an even lower roof over here. And then, 2 weeks ago, we had a higher roof. This was the first high roof we had in a long time. Okay, so if we have a higher roof and we have a higher floor, that means the market is shifting. You might not see it, but in the details, it is ultimately shifting, right? We also did fill the last of the last imbalance, right? Imbalance is practically, ladies and gentlemen, when the market goes up too fast or too fast to the upside or too fast to the downside, leaving a little bit of a gap, leaving a lack of real support and resistance, which is why you want things to really be fundamental, right? And we can see there's no other type of candle like this where it's just kind of empty and there's a gap, right? There is none. When there was one over here, it got filled, right? Like when there's a little bit of space here, it got filled. Right? Every time there's that type of space, it just gets filled. So we can see this is the literal last gap. Literal last gap. So I expect very, very nice reversals, ladies and gentlemen, to the upside. Okay, I really, really do. Last time we did say, look, when we flip the scale, it does look like the markets do want to dump this way, right? The markets want to dump this way. Boom, 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 right? Which will obviously, when you flip it back to normal, it is a pump. So look, I am not worried, right? I am not worried because even on a bigger time frame, we shifted from the market kind of going up and down sideways to just sideways to slowly changing the details and slowly consistently having a nice higher high and a nice higher low, even though it's hard to see on the daily, right? The weekly shows it the best. So for me, the markets are just, they're showing signs of reversals very, very soon. I know it's being a turtle. I know it's being annoying. But the point is, at least we went from selling off to sideways, and we are showing very, very nice indication that we are much closer to already starting to go to the upside than continuing to go sideways for even more and more time. That is just the reality, right? That is just the reality. You have to remember moves like back here when they went sideways just for a short amount of time, even if it was just 2 months, which, that doesn't sound that short, but we've already been going sideways since practically the beginning of April. So April, May, June, and July, 4 months really, right? It's been 2 times longer than this down period over here. But you have to remember, these markets we're setting up to go from like $3 practically to $21. So a 7 times gain, right? But these markets over here we're setting up to go from like $5 to like 70. Okay, so we're setting up for bigger gains. And that is just the truth. That is just the reality. For those that are new, right? We talked about this. I haven't talked about this in some time, but we had one high over here, another high here. We had one high over here, another high here. We had kind of like a support here. We had kind of a support here. We had down, we went down, right? We had a little bit up and fail. We had a little bit up and fail. And then we had sideways, and then now we have sideways, and then the upside, and soon the upside, right? It's literally the same thing as playing out. But the reason why it takes longer is because we're not going to go from 3 to 21. We're going to go from 5 to 70. You understand? So it has to play out longer. It has to go in more sideways because for us to be getting these big bursts, it requires more time. And that is just the reality, people, right? That is just the reality, right? I'm still super optimistic that, something like ICP will be hitting a minimum. And on the worst case scenario, worst case scenario would be roughly $35 because we do have the support and resistance and we do have a weekly order block here. But that might be like pump number one. That might be, markets kind of start going crazy, you know, boom, oh my God, altcoin season's almost here. Markets go crazy, sell off. Then actual altcoin season is going to be here. And that's when we go from like, 30 back all the way up to even upwards of $80, right? I do believe we will be tapping this order block. So for me, the real minimum should be $70, right? And if we are looking to be sweeping liquidity, we could even reach upwards of $90, right? Sweep this $87 zone, go up a little bit higher and then crash. Okay. And the market cap isn't too unrealistic. If we were supposed to go to roughly $90 and we go to something like ICP, right? $90, ladies and gentlemen, right? If we're at 2.7 billion market cap, which is $5, if we were to 10x, that would be 27 billion, right? That would be roughly $50. Now let's say we just did double that, that would be $100 for roughly 54 billion market cap. So for roughly the mid to high 40s, like the 45 to 50 billion market cap would be roughly the $90 range. And we talked about ICP, how this should be one of those coins that at the minimum go into that 35 to 45 billion market cap range. It really, really should. So I'm super confident that it will. Right. Of course, we also talked the possibility of it going upwards of 100 billion market cap, but some things have to line, and we are going to address that in a different video. We can see before we end this off, we are at 2.7 billion market cap, 73 million volume, and things are just looking very, very good, right? Things are looking very, very good. 84% bullish sentiment, and I expect for us to really, see some lifeline in this cycle. I'm super excited about ICP. Let me know what you guys think. I love you guys so much. I'll talk to you guys next time. Goodbye.